Hello, and welcome to the Social Protection Podcast. I'm your host, Jo Sharp. Between 2015 and 2025, the number of people displaced by conflict and disasters worldwide nearly doubled. Today, more than 123 million people are forcibly displaced globally, with about 42 million of them refugees. Many of the countries that host refugees are low or middle income, without adequate safety nets for their own citizens, let alone their neighbours. But with protracted conflicts, people are displaced for an increasingly long time, years or even decades. And that means forced displacement is no longer just an emergency issue, but also a structural development challenge. So in today's episode, we're talking about the dual challenges of building social protection systems and extending them to include and protect refugees. With me today, I'm delighted to welcome three guests. Pablo Acosta is lead economist at the Social Policy Global Unit at the World Bank. Sarah Haig is senior advisor at the Economic and Social Policy Global Practice at UNICEF. And Mattia Polvanesi is senior social protection specialist at UNHCR. Welcome, Pablo, Sarah, and Mattia.
Hello, thank you for inviting me.
Hi, Jo, I'm happy to be here.
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Jo, for the invitation.
Mattia, can we start off by talking a bit about how the dynamics of displacement are changing and how realistic are the prospects for people to return home in many of these contexts?
So first of all, let's break down the figure you mentioned. So 123 million. What does that include? So more than half of these are internally displaced people, about 70 million. Then we have over 42 million of refugees. Where are these people from? Many different countries. Sudan is the largest global displacement crisis with more than 14 million Sudanese displaced, but also Syrians, Afghan, Ukrainian, and actually these four nationalities alone account for more than 1/3 of the global figure of displaced people. Now, to get to your question on why we need to increasingly consider displacement as a development issue rather than a humanitarian issue, I think there are 3 points here. The first is that humanitarian systems are at a breaking point. They're unable to respond to forced displacement, not only due to the scale of displacement that we mentioned, but also to its complexity. We have 4 out of 5 refugees that are displaced for many years, in many cases for decades even. Also displaced, they live increasingly within the host communities in urban areas rather than camps. And the traditional long-term solutions, which for UNHCR are return, resettlement, and integration, they are increasingly out of reach. A second point is that access to social protection and in general to national systems required for many decades setting up parallel systems. Working on inclusion means that we can increasingly reduce these parallel systems and work towards common platforms, being registration or targeting or payment systems. The third point I wanted to make is that it's becoming increasingly relevant and important for agencies that work on displacement to work more closely with state systems. And there are a number of global commitments that go into this direction. The 1951 Refugee Convention recognizes the right to social protection, and it's reinforced by the 2018 Global Compact on Refugees. And these tools, they introduce the concept also of responsibility sharing between host governments and the international community. And in parallel to that, there are a number of social security conventions that clearly recognize the principle of equality of treatment between non-nationals and nationals, and therefore the fact that they all need to access social protection on an equal basis.
Sarah, generally speaking, what are the social and economic impacts of large-scale displacement, both for the people who are themselves refugees or displaced, but of course also for the host communities and services where they are residing?
Thanks for the question. And as you mentioned, I work for UNICEF. So I have to start off by underlining that it's often the case when a shock hits, children are disproportionately more affected than other population groups. So we know that children make up 30% of the world's population, but they account for more than 40% of people who are forcibly displaced. So we're seeing children grow up in these contexts. It's all they've ever known. They've had their schooling interrupted, protection interrupted throughout their entire childhoods in many cases. And even for young people as well, they face significantly less access to livelihoods opportunities and often limited support to help them overcome barriers like financial inclusion. Secondly, we cannot underestimate the strain that big inflows of displaced people that Mattia was talking about can cause on poor communities. And we know that the vast majority of people hosted are in low and middle income countries. So globally, the impact is already heavily inequitable. But as we know, the shared responsibility by international partners is already under strain due to funding cuts and the overall geopolitical situation. But I don't want us to lose sight of one thing that we don't talk about too much, is that in some contexts or in many contexts, the integration of displaced persons can lead to economic returns and even benefits. Chad, for example, one of the poorest countries in the world, home to a very large displaced population, but evidence from recent World Bank research suggests that granting them the right to work and move around freely could actually reduce the costs of assistance by as much as 80%. Similarly, in more developed countries like in Poland, where Ukrainian refugees contribute over 2% of GDP through tax revenues. So we do tend to focus on the cost, but there are these opportunities where in some cases, if we focus on the national systems and the national programs and that integration, it can improve for all population groups as a result of systems becoming more inclusive.
Thank you. And we'll come back to that point about the economic benefits of inclusion. Pablo, as displacement becomes increasingly protracted, as we've just been hearing, humanitarian responses are often described as necessary but not sufficient. They've also just been described as, under strain. And indeed, official development assistance and finance writ large is under strain globally. What are the challenges national governments especially face when trying to, on the one hand, strengthen national social protection systems, and on the other hand, extend them to refugees and groups that may not be within that kind of citizen cohort that would typically be able to benefit from protection?
Thanks, Charles. This is a very important and challenging question, I would say. As my colleague Mattia and Sarah noted, displacement is increasingly becoming long-term, in many countries, and governments are really being asked to pull off a kind of balancing act that is quite difficult. On one hand, they need to strengthen their own social protection system for citizens, but on the other hand, also now they had to be also serving the two refugees and forcibly displaced population. And of course, in a context where fiscal space and development finance is actually shrinking. So there are several factors that make this quite a challenge. And I want to reflect especially on the report that we recently produced on this topic. So one is we notice about capacity constraints, especially in places where refugees tend to live. We're talking about remote and underserved regions where state systems are usually weakest to begin with. And it's already hard for them to reach the poor nationals in places like Cameroon, Ethiopia, where the government has the intention to include, but also, of course, this remoteness of border regions where they are located makes getting delivery systems in place quite complicated. Then there is, of course, the political and institutional challenges. In many countries, refugees also often sit outside the formal mandate of social protection ministries. Again, as in the case of Ethiopia, where responsibility for refugees sit in the refugee agency that had not necessarily the experience to run safety nets, while the responsibility of managing and roll over the largest social protection programs for citizens are focused elsewhere. Also, of course, extending public programs to non-nationals in some cases can be politically sensitive, particularly when budgets are tight and host communities themselves are struggling or sometimes even not fully included in the systems. The third aspect is the reality that many of these social protection systems at the national level were not designed for displacement. So that means the standard targeting and enrollment process needs to be adapted, which adds, of course, complexity and cost. And finally, the challenge of transitioning in many countries from humanitarian systems to government ones. We talk about how humanitarian actors sometimes can be faster, while national systems are more, slow, difficult to change. Aligning the two without creating the gas duplication or undermining trust is technically and institutionally difficult. But you see countries that have managed to do that over time, like Turkey is one example. Of course, financing and sustainability is going to remain at the front and center, again, for countries that have already limited fiscal resources.
Mattia, just before we go on and look more deeply at some of these factors that enable and constrain inclusion, I did just want to come back to the term social protection from that kind of national system perspective. The protection is thinking about sort of protection from vulnerabilities and shocks across the life course. But when we think about the term protection in a humanitarian context, it has other connotations. Why is it so important to centre protection itself in terms of safety, dignity, legal status, when extending social protection to refugees and displaced people?
Thanks, Joe, for the question. I think this is a often overlooked point. So, first of all, I think protection has always been one of the core functions of social protection. One would say that social protection has a protection function from vulnerabilities, from deprivation. It has also a prevention function from life cycle risks and a promotion function to enhance income. So protection was always there from the beginning, I would say. And UNHCR, being a protection agency, for us, engaging in social protection, it is first and foremost a right-based issue. So we look, for example, if displaced populations are able to acquire and also effectively enjoy and realize social protection rights. And when they do, we try to monitor how this inclusion in social protection systems generate protection outcomes, protection dividends. And they do. So what we see is that, first of all, social protection allows to access basic needs more predictably than humanitarian assistance. It reduces negative coping strategies, and also it mitigates this reliance on emergency humanitarian assistance. But also there is a legal element, because having a more rule-based access to national systems really enhances accountability. And maybe another point is that social protection and inclusion in those systems helps with linking with other national services. Because I think we all agree that social protection alone, it's not silver bullet. It needs to be complemented by access to other services and also to access to jobs. And last but not least, inclusion in social protection, we see it as a sustainable pathway towards a more durable solutions, which could be, for example, local integration in the host country.
Sarah, you're speaking to us from Kenya. In East Africa, including the Horn and Great Lakes region, includes lots of countries, host to a really large cohort, estimated 5.2 million refugees and asylum seekers. That's around 14% of the global total. But several of these countries, low and middle income, as you were saying earlier, have managed to invest in national social protections while also hosting these large displaced populations. So can you tell us what that looks like in practice, and how has that been possible?
So this part of sub-Saharan Africa is a very interesting place to be, where, as you said, countries have been scaling up national social protection systems, but gradually, very gradually over time, but at the same time are increasingly hosting larger populations of displaced people. So I think the central point that we keep coming back to is that we mustn't lose sight of the systems agenda, right? There's a tendency sometimes still to focus on these more short-term, humanitarian, parallel initiatives in the moment. But as others have said, we have this responsibility first and foremost to strengthen national systems prior to a shock happening, prior to a displacement crisis unfolding. Because asking a government to include refugees in their national program is a hard conversation to have when the national system itself has not been prioritized with adequate support in the past, where maybe just a tiny proportion of citizens are receiving support from that national program. So it's much easier in maybe other countries in other regions where they have stronger systems. You know, look at Brazil, for example. That's a strong system by comparison. And they've been able to provide legal access to people coming from other countries, such as Venezuela. But what about when there's no system or a very nascent system? In that case, then humanitarian system needs to be designed with national actors with a view to providing some kind of foundation for a national system for the future. This is what UNICEF did in Lebanon, a country with almost no national social protection system a few years ago, but we worked to integrate poor and vulnerable Lebanese households into humanitarian responses, demonstrating what worked. And on that basis, we were able to lead support to the government to design and implement the country's first ever national grant, which reaches now both Lebanese and Syrian, despite the very challenging political situation. So coming back to East Africa and this region, I think in many countries, the central issue is just about very low coverage and still low financing of national social protection systems. If we are not supporting and investing in those systems from the get-go, it's a difficult political argument to have. It's not just about the political will of integrating refugees, it's that political will to scale up social protection for even national populations. We did a piece of research recently, and financing to social protection in this region is half what it is in low-income countries on average. But nonetheless, we do still have good examples. Many countries are still moving towards more inclusive systems. Countries like Kenya, Uganda, Ethiopia, they have legal frameworks in place providing recognition and integration of refugees into various national systems, programs such as the labor market. But still very often the incentives at play mean that there still remain these instances of humanitarian programs running in parallel to national ones. And we do see hope of moving in the right direction where those programs at least mirror national systems, but I think it's a critical moment to get it right and to signal to countries that we want to invest first and foremost in their national systems and programs.
Mattia, I wanted to come back to you and ask for other examples of countries that have made progress in including refugees in social protection systems, and I guess particularly why you think they've been successful.
Yeah, before I start with some concrete examples, just to say that there is no one-size-fits-all approach. So there are different pathways for inclusion. But having said this, what are the main success factors for inclusion? The first one is political will and inclusive legal frameworks. Second one being convergence of data systems between humanitarian and social protection. And the third is financing. So on the first one, although not a strict requirement, let's say, to have a policy or a law that's recognized the principle of inclusion, really having this type of equal treatment provisions embedded in law provide a foundation for us to be working on inclusion with governments. We do have a platform, which is the Global Refugee Forum, which happens every 4 years in Geneva. So we had the second one in 2023, and a lot of governments made explicit commitments to make their systems more inclusive. For example, Mauritania made a pledge on including refugees in national social protection, but also transforming camps into integrated settlements with access to national services. And these commitments are being gradually translated and operationalized, of course, with support from international agencies through an inclusion roadmap. The second success factors that we see oftentimes is the convergence of data system. And this means inclusion in social registries when they are up and running, but also more in general information management systems and statistical inclusion. These can happen quite smoothly in countries that have very solid information management systems like Brazil, Cadastro Único, where Venezuelans are included, or Colombia, CISBAN. But it can also happen in countries that have weaker or emerging data systems. And an example here could be Kenya, where over 110,000 refugee households have been gradually included by the government into the enhanced social registry. And this, of course, requires support, technical and financial, by international agencies, and in some cases also adaptations to the system. The last point, and I'll be very brief, but the financing is also instrumental for inclusion. And the only point I want to make here is that inclusion requires a multi-layered financing approach that needs to include domestic financing as well as external support, especially in lower and middle income countries. And domestic financing, when it's there and it's allocated and there is a budget line for refugee inclusion, really signals ownership and anchors the reforms. For example, in Mauritania, we have seen that 80% of Takavul, which is the flagship social assistance program, is financed and covered by the national budget. And refugees have access to that. So it reflects a strong political commitment. Then, of course, that needs to be also underpinned by international financing, concessional financing.
Sarah, we've touched on political will in a number of cases, and I guess this is a really critical question. What does it take for a country to have the kind of both the political will and the community acceptance to be prepared to extend these kinds of resources to refugees? Why does it work well in some contexts and not others?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I don't think we sometimes sufficiently analyze the political economy in different contexts, because as we said, every country is different, every community is different, and we need to understand what are those drivers in each situation. And I think when it comes to political will, honestly, sometimes we could be a bit more sophisticated in our engagement. I think sometimes there's this tendency to come at the issue of integrating refugees into national programs very head-on in a sort of very direct way. This is a rights issue, therefore it's the thing that should be done. But many governments find this confrontational, and it can actually then lead to shutting down the dialogue on the issue of integrating FDPs itself. So I see a couple of sort of side doors to help us get a bit more traction on this issue. One aspect is that these conversations tend to focus on refugees, whereas in fact, globally, the majority of forcibly displaced people are internally displaced, as Mattia mentioned at the beginning of the conversation. So that sounds a bit obvious, but this is important because including internally displaced citizens into their own country's social protection systems is still a very challenging issue. It still needs to be addressed. And if that's the majority of people, well, politically, that can sometimes be a lot more straightforward. We can also learn some very useful lessons from program design and delivery where IDPs have been effectively included into national programs using sort of simple tweaks and adjustments. And a second opportunity that links us back to this point about operational entry points that Pablo and Mattia already referred to. I think this is the most important entry point when it comes to political will. It's sort of getting political will through stealth, if you like. Instead of addressing the issue of integration very bluntly, it's about finding operational barriers to inclusion which can benefit multiple population groups, both citizens and refugees. So it includes things like data systems that accommodate dynamic entry and exit, or payment mechanisms that are more mobile and adaptive. And it means that once the government is on board politically with the idea of gradually expanding their national social protection system, if we can build it from the get-go in an adaptive way, that makes the inclusion of populations on the move much easier later on. And thirdly, I would say it's not just about getting refugees into cash programs. Not all governments like cash programs, even for their own citizens. It's broader than that. It involves helping communities and governments see the benefits of allowing FDPs to work in their new communities, send their kids to school every day, get access to basic healthcare. So this changes the conversation about forcibly displaced people from one about just handouts to one about integration and stability.
Earlier, you all touched on this idea also of the potential kind of economic benefits of inclusion. So, Pablo, can you talk a bit more about the need to consider financial inclusion, access to work, recognition of skills and livelihoods for people who are displaced? How does that feature in this picture?
We need to start from the basic premise that refugees should not be seen as beneficiaries, but also as economic actors. Social protection works best when it helps unlock that potential rather than simply managing vulnerability. And we are noticing that in many countries, this is increasingly the norm now, that refugees are having more freedom of movement, more freedom to work or right to work, and social assistance sometimes is being paired with livelihood support, right? I mean, in our report, we mentioned, for instance, the case of Uganda in that regard. We need to also, of course, look at different dimensions for this to really materialize. One aspect is access to work and livelihood. We know that cash transfers alone tend to have fragile impacts, but when we are combined with the skills training, with livelihood support, right to work, they help move people from dependence to self-reliance. In Latin America, this has been also the norm in many countries, so we need to look at it as examples. Colombia, Brazil, Argentina, that they have allowed policies for displaced Venezuelans, for instance, to access to jobs aligned with their skills. We need to consider also financial inclusions. Many refugees live entirely in cash and outside formal systems. When social assistance is delivered through government channels, for instance, using digital payments, they can also be a potential entry point to the formal economy. That allows refugees to access to payment, savings, and eventually credit that can allow people to stabilize consumption, invest, plans beyond month-to-month survival. Again, we notice examples like Turkey, where delivering assistance through debit card didn't just meet the immediate needs, but also allow refugees into digital payment systems. This skill recognition is another critical aspect for this to materialize. So many refugees arrive with the skills that the host economies actually need, but these skills are not recognized, invisible. So when the qualifications are recognized, we know the employers can simply verify them. And once systems start to do this, social protection stops being just a safety net and acting as a bridge into the labor market. I wanted to mention also that when this virtuous circle can emerge, inclusion in social protection stabilizes households and reduces negative coping strategy. So that basically means that not just refugees, but whole communities can also benefit as well. We also help with the political support for inclusive systems. So we are not talking about replacing social protection with job or just forgetting about social protection. It's basically connecting both. When they come together, we can see a situation where refugees shift from being seen as a fiscal burden to actually actors that can contribute to host economies. So everything becomes more sustainable and also welfare improves for everybody involved.
I'll just build on Pablo's points on what he said about this virtuous circle, right, between social protection, jobs, and financial inclusion. So in an earlier question, I talked about protection dividends and the rights, but this is clearly not a narrative that will ease this conversation with governments. And that's why it's important that we collectively work on building an investment case for inclusion. So what are not just the protection dividends, but what are the development dividends and the fiscal dividends of inclusion? And the good news is that there is an increasing body of evidence showing how refugee inclusion in national social protection systems really offer high returns per dollar spent. And provided that refugees have access to social protection and access to work, then they contribute to the local economy. They can fill labor shortages, they can boost productivity, they pay taxes, and so on. The IMF World Economic Outlook of last year, in its chapter 3 dedicated to displacement, it calculated that a 10% increase in refugee inflows raises outputs by around 0.2% after 5 years in the hosting economy. And the gains for the host economies are larger where refugees, of course, have work rights, freedom of movement, and their skills are recognized, as Pablo was mentioning. And then another thing, a joint study between the World Bank and the UNHCR aimed at measuring the impact of inclusion, it really showcased this triple win. So the fact that when we have actual and effective inclusion in national systems, first, poverty among displaced people reduces, fiscal pressure on host government eases, and thirdly, resources then can be freed for broader socioeconomic interventions and development, let's say, for all. And I will conclude saying that these fiscal dividends in many contexts are already visible. For example, in Jordan, the economic participation of Syrian refugees is estimated to be reducing annual costs by about $860 million compared to a scenario where they were not allowed to work. In Poland, the very rapid inclusion of Ukraine refugees into the labor market and in social protection system led to the employment rates for refugees comparable to the ones of nationals, and also contributed to a 2.7% of GDP in 2024.
Sarah, you've touched on some examples earlier, but I'm really interested in this idea of partnerships between international and national actors and how they can work together to support this extension of national systems to refugees. What is the role of those partnerships and leveraging the different strengths of different actors?
Yeah, I think what we're seeing in recent years is, of course, that partnerships are crucial between international and national actors. Although I am very aware that we have 3 representatives from international agencies only in this conversation. We don't have, national stakeholders to speak to the issue. But it's a good question, and it's not a straightforward one. I think, firstly, we have to ask ourselves if the international community is living up to the responsibility to adequately support countries that are the first country reached by forcibly displaced populations. We know that most people just cross the border. Countries like Chad, we've talked about, under immense strain. Are they really getting the support that they need in comparison to the scale of the problem? But where we do see progress is through these multi-stakeholder platforms and dialogues. We've talked about the Global Refugee Forum. There's also the Prospects Partnership initiated by the Dutch government, which isn't just about providing support to displaced populations. It's about finding these longer-term solutions to strengthen national systems, scale up coverage, and find these operational solutions that we talked about to integrate different groups into national programs. So a couple of examples from Prospects in this region. I think Mattia already mentioned in Kenya, where Prospects has supported the registration of over 100,000 refugees into the enhanced single registry, or in Uganda, where policy reforms in civil registration have increased access to birth certificates and national IDs for refugee and host community children, promoting, therefore, legal identity and inclusion in national databases. But in this current global environment, we need to go maybe beyond these conversations that are related particularly to refugees and displaced populations. You might have seen last year in the G20, the only ministerial call to action that was put out was on social protection. And it talks about the importance of supporting governments to scale up social protection with a tangible target, including for refugees and other vulnerable groups. So I think overall incentives need to shift for international actors. It's not about the numbers reached anymore. It's about crafting these opportunities, making the slow progress towards integrating people into different social services, giving them the right to work, and finding these operational adjustments to national programs that can gradually scale up the inclusion of forcibly displaced people.
Pablo, the last question is for you, and it is one of the most important. Can you talk a bit about how concessional financing mechanisms have helped governments invest in inclusive social protection despite that limited fiscal space?
Thank you for throwing the most difficult question. No, but definitely concessional financing, I believe, has been absolutely central in making more inclusive the social protection system in refugee hosting countries, no? So as you probably know, at the World Bank, we also work and host with the Refugee and Host Community Window through the IDA, which is our International Development Association, which focuses on providing concessional financing and other type of financing as well, specifically to low-income countries. And we think this has really changed the equation in the refugee space. We start from a simple but important idea. Hosting refugees is a global public good and should not be seen just as a national responsibility. And that basically can allow this concessional financing to expand social protection, not just to refugees, but also to own citizens without crowding fiscal spending that is very scarce in these countries. The IDA Refugee and Host Community Window, for instance, have assisted countries like Ethiopia and Cameroon. Again, it's important to see that this concessional financing is needed, not just for paying social protection cash transfers, but also for helping these countries in the challenges that we mentioned before, investing in systems, how we can help build social registry, payment platforms, delivery capacity, recognition of skills, and etc. That have made possible in many countries to extend safety nets to refugee host communities together, and rather than relying in indefinite humanitarian assistance. The other thing that it contributes is also with predictability and risk sharing. So these are concessional windows that provide multi-year financing. It's not just one-off. and a grant with concessional terms that basically matters a lot for these countries. That way, governments can plan, scale gradually, invest in institutional capacity instead of launching from one humanitarian funding cycle to next. We notice examples on that regard of good planning or multi-year concessional financing in countries like Bangladesh that has also been shifting from pure humanitarian delivery to more predictable systems. Access to this window is linked to political commitments. So that is important. That gives incentives for countries to include these refugees into national systems or allow access to work or freedom of movements, which also, in a way, provide more longer-term solutions. And finally, concessional financing should not be restricted to refugees, but also to hosts. So by financing host communities, it helps also reduce social tensions, making economic inclusion and political inclusion more viable, and also has been critical for government buy-in and sustainability.
Pablo, Sarah, and Mattia, thank you very much for joining me on the Social Protection Podcast today.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Joe. It was a pleasure to be here today.
Yes, thanks a lot.
Before we go, we like to end each episode with some quick wins. We ask a guest to bring in some recommendations for news, events, research that have sparked their interest and that we think you should know more about. Joining us for Quick Wins today is Lauren Whitehead, lead on inclusive social protection and gender at UNICEF. Welcome back to the Social Protection Podcast, Lauren.
Thank you so much. So good to be back.
So, as we speak, you've just returned from a special symposium on gender responsive and inclusive social protection that was held in Bangkok last week. The symposium showcased findings from 2 significant research and implementation partnerships involving UNICEF, Australia's DFAT, and the UK's Foreign and Commonwealth Office, which have contributed to the body of knowledge on what works, why, and where for gender responsive social protection. Gender responsive social protection and the role of social protection in addressing things like gender-based violence has been the subject of a lot of work in recent years. I think it's one of those issues we've been tracking on this podcast over time. How is the evidence and practice in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, especially, contributing to the global store of knowledge?
I think that's a great question. And that was something that we set out to make one of our core objectives of the symposium. So I would say that the symposium really illuminated very clearly how so much of what we know works and why on a global stage plays out in the region and vice versa. So, for example, there were a number of common themes that came up throughout the symposium: climate, crisis, caregiving, jobs, maternal and reproductive health, gender-based violence, intimate partner violence. These are all key issues that women and girls everywhere encounter in one way or another. And these are all issues that we believe social protection can address. And that's what largely most of the participants wanted to focus on. I would say specifically that some of the work that DFAT did in their partnership on gender responsive social protection in Southeast Asia included a bit of landscaping across the region, which illuminated some of these key topics by country. And that is really what has underpinned the country level implementation of that partnership. So, for example, combating adolescent pregnancy and early marriage in the Philippines, or addressing care and support in Cambodia, and so forth. I would also say that one of the favorite moments for me was actually listening to government officials from the Philippines hear a case example from Uganda, which was related to adolescent mothers, and looking at what some of the preventative and then recourse methods are for addressing adolescent pregnancy and preventing future pregnancies, and exchanging on how those lessons could actually be used to apply to the program in the Philippines, which is called Protect Teen. And that was just encapsulating kind of what the purpose of the symposium was for that cross-regional exchange.
Thank you, Lauren. That was a lovely and, I will say, unintentional foreshadowing of the episode we're working on for next month, which is looking at social protection for adolescents. And we're hoping to speak with the government of Philippines as well to hear about that pilot.
Oh my gosh, I had no idea.
So we talk about quick wins, and you've mentioned one of those great moments of shared learning. What were some of the other insights that you felt came from policymakers and civil society at the symposium and through those discussions?
Sure. I think the fact that there was just so much solid appetite expressed from government to really tackle some of the challenges around gender responsive social protection head on was extremely encouraging. Seeing how much is already being done, I think very often people think in this space on inclusive social protection that it's some sort of a new area, a new add on, something else that we have to think about layering into social protection. But in reality, it's not in many ways. And it's more about how we approach the work, editing essentially the lenses that we take to the work in social protection to make it more impactful. And so we had governments around the room that were talking about how they're already giving cash to women, for example, or how they're linking livelihoods and jobs to their social protection programs. Even things like, for example, Mongolia talks about revising pension schemes to be able to account for the shorter working years that a woman might have due to caregiving or due to being in formal labor market, et cetera. They talked about removing conditionalities on cash, extending benefits to adolescent mothers, just many different things in that vein. We also heard a lot about the importance of political economy and how political economy really underscores whether or not there is or is not receptivity to gender responsive social protection. So recognizing that we don't design and implement these policies and programs in a vacuum, and that they are influenced as much by the political economy in the countries where they take place as the geopolitical circumstances around the globe, quite frankly. And so I think that came through really clearly. And then I think there was also a recurring refrain time and again from not only civil society, but also international agencies, also governments around participatory approaches and what it means to more meaningfully engage women's organizations, to engage girl-led organizations, organizations of persons with disabilities, et cetera, and how that really builds greater social accountability of social protection to the populations that it serves.
Absolutely fascinating. So, speaking of geopolitics, we are seeing some pushback internationally on global efforts towards gender equality in some fora. What's next, do you think, in terms of advocating for and building more gender responsive systems?
Yeah, so I would say it sometimes feels, not sometimes, it often feels like an uphill battle, but that is precisely why we keep pushing on. In many ways, I think a colleague of mine on our gender team said that the pushback is what actually shows us that it's working. And I try to hold on to that thought, even in some of the toughest of arenas that we are in right now in terms of some of the pushback. I think what it means, though, is that as a sector, as a social protection sector, we need to do a stronger and a better job of emphasizing some of the undeniable benefits for the population writ large from gender responsive social protection. So yes, of course, it uplifts and supports women and girls significantly, but it also has generally very far-reaching impacts for all of society. And I think it's helpful for us to constantly underscore that, especially some of the economic impacts, which make for very, very strong arguments, especially in arenas with, say, ministries of finance. That was something we talked about a lot at the symposium. I think we also need to really remain grounded in our core principles of equity and inclusion and stand by these despite whatever winds might buffet us. I know within the SPEAC-B gender working group, we actually came up with a common set of principles across gender responsive social protection that would be a bit of a guiding North Star for our partners working in this space. Sort of no matter what you come up against, these are our red lines, even though we may have different organizational perspectives on how to carry out some of these things. And then I also think we need to ensure that the areas where we know impact women and girls the most are still invested in, like access to health, access to education, access to employment, care and support policies. These are things that we know, no matter what, affect women and girls. And a lot of the work through social protection is making linkages and strengthening some of the service provision that comes from these sectors for individuals who are receiving social protection.
We can link to those principles that you've mentioned for fighting the good fight on socialprotection.org. Lauren Whitehead, thank you so much for joining me again on the Social Protection Podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciated it. And thank you to everyone who participated in the symposium, especially DFAT and FCDO as our core sponsors.
Before we go, we're marking another special occasion with this month's episode. It's 5 years since the Social Protection podcast was first launched in March 2021. Over this time, the podcast has brought together voices from a wide range of institutions, countries, and perspectives to explore the evolving debates, policies, and practices shaping social protection worldwide. This milestone reflects the commitment of our guests, our partners, as well as the dedicated work of the producers, editors, and collaborators behind the scenes. And of course to you, the listener. Thank you for being part of this journey. We are a production of socialprotection.org. Find the Social Protection Podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Back next month. See you then.